Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Mr. Klingner. Welcome to the Asia Initiative Lecture Series. My name is Amanda Wan, and I'm the founder and coordinator of the Asia Initiative Lecture Series at the Institute of World Politics. For those who are new to the Institute of World Politics, IWP is a graduate school of statecraft, national security, international affairs, and intelligence. We have a doctoral program as well as 5 master's programs and 18 certificates of graduate study and a continuing education program. The objective of this lecture series is to broaden the scope and discussion on a range of intelligence, foreign policy, and security issues attendant to the Asian geopolitical, socioeconomic, and cultural spheres of influence. Today, we have a fascinating speaker, Mr. Bruce Klingner, who will be presenting a lecture on the Biden administration faces growing North Korean threat. Mr. Klingner specializes in Korean and Japanese affairs as the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. He has testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He's a frequent commentator in U.S. and foreign media. His articles and commentary have appeared in major American and foreign publications, and he's a regular guest on broadcast and cable news outlets. He's a regular contributor to the international and security sections of the Daily Signal. From 1996 to 2001, Mr. Klingner was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea, responsible for the analysis of political, military, economic, and leadership issues for the President of the United States and other senior U.S. policymakers. In 1993 to 1994, he was the chief of CIA's Korea branch, which analyzed military developments during a nuclear crisis in North Korea. Mr. Bruce Klingner, welcome very much, and thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and thank you all for attending. I'll get to the Biden administration policy, but first I'm going to spend a bit of time on the North Korean threat, which is varied and includes nuclear, missile, as well as cyber. And then I'm going to discuss sort of U.S. policy in general, and then eventually get to the Biden policy, which, although they still are completing their North Korea policy review, I think there's some indications as to where it may or may not go, and there's some knowns and unknowns. So, first of all, I think it's useful for context to look at the North Korean threat. And just to emphasize that even in the intelligence community, the threat assessment are estimates. There are best guesses. There, a series of assessments that eventually come up with a number of how many nuclear weapons do you think they have, or how far along are they on a certain program. But North Korea is known as the hardest of the hard target for very good reason. When I shifted over to work North Korea, I had come from working the Soviet Union. And in retrospect, the Soviet Union was an open book compared to North Korea. Each of the sources of intelligence has almost unique constraints when it comes to North Korea. With imagery, they put a lot of their facilities underground. And then also there's terrain masking, where, if you fly a Cessna plane over a town in Kansas, which is very flat, if you fly over 3 different times, you can see the entire city 3 times. Whereas if you're flying a Cessna down the valleys of Manhattan, of the skyscrapers, you can't see what's on the other side of the skyscraper. And in a way, the North Korea work in a similar way. And signal intelligence has a lot of constraints because of encryption and landlines and human sources. It's hard to run agents in North Korea, even for South Korea. So it's a lot of difficulties. And just some observations on the threat, or the threat assessments. What I found over the years or the decades is there's been a tendency by a lot of folks to underestimate North Korea's capabilities, to downplay it or even dismiss it. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is just sort of a dismissive attitude towards North Korea. There's sort of that, well, isn't North Korea a joke? I just saw a cartoon with Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il depicted as a baby playing with missiles as toys. So they can't really be a threat, right? Or just sort of a condescending view of, well, they couldn't possibly do something so sophisticated as nuclear weapons or cyber attack capabilities. And I remember after the 2014 Sony hack that North Korea did against Sony Pictures, uh, I was doing a lot of TV interviews, and there was a lot of disbelief by the announcers. And frequently they would put up the fairly famous nighttime satellite photo of North Korea and the surrounding countries at night, where South Korea, Japan, and cities in China were ablaze with lights, and North Korea was basically a black hole except some lights in Pyongyang. And they would say, well, if they can't even keep the lights on, they can't possibly be capable of cyber attack or nuclear weapons. Well, they can. They just prioritize military over the civilian life. Another aspect of being dismissive is that North Korea hasn't yet proved something, and therefore they don't have it. And some of that is politically or ideologically driven, in that it would be inconvenient if North Korea had that capability or was working toward that capability, because it would either mean they're cheating or it would make diplomacy difficult if they're already working towards a certain program. So I think a lot of times people have underestimated or been surprised when North Korea does something, whereas experts who have been following it for quite some time will see it as, yeah, we've been predicting this, we've been following it. Maybe they went quicker or slower than we had predicted, but yeah, it's not unexpected. So, how this has sort of manifested itself over the years is back in the 1990s. Some people were dismissive of North Korea's plutonium based nuclear weapons program. Even some government agencies were saying, well, you can't prove they have plutonium fissile material, so therefore we will say they don't have it. During the George W. Bush administration, there was a lot of resistance to North Korea having highly enriched uranium. That first it was just an invention of George Bush, or when the evidence was becoming more and more public, people would say, well, it's not cheating because it's not a program; it's a program to develop a program. Which is sort of like saying it's just a small bank robbery, so it's not bad, or it's a conspiracy to commit a crime, not the crime itself, but a conspiracy is itself a crime. Then in 2007, when Israel bombed a facility in Syria, which turned out to be a nuclear reactor that was being partially built by North Korea or with North Korean assistance, some people were dismissive, saying that it was a Scud missile storage site. It couldn't possibly be a reactor because that would be proliferation by North Korea. Then we had debates over, does North Korea have the capability to miniaturize a nuclear device into a nuclear weapon to put it on missiles? Then we had debates over that North Korea's ICBMs couldn't possibly reach the United States, or some would say, well, they can only reach Hawaii or Alaska, which were part of the United States. And then we saw some indications, and rocket scientists did some amazing analysis based on just photos of static rocket engine tests from the size and shape and color of the flames to indicate it was a new kind of fuel and oxidizer, and that yes, it could actually reach the entire continental U.S. And people were assessing that a year before they did some ICBM tests in 2017, where even though they did it to very high lofted trajectories so that it wouldn't fly over Japan, when people did the extrapolation of the range, it indicated that the first test could reach half of the continental US, and the test later in 2017 could reach all the way down to Florida and beyond. And kind of a current debate people have is that, well, they haven't demonstrated that they have a survivable reentry vehicle, that we don't know or we can't prove that North Korea's warheads could survive the parabolic trajectory and reentry back into the Earth's atmosphere. And again, I think it's just sort of downplaying or dismissing the threat. So where are they with their nukes and missiles? Again, it's the best estimate. What we saw was in 2017, there were some leaked U.S. intelligence documents where a defense intelligence agency and a CIA leaked estimates where the intel community is saying that North Korea likely had between 30 and 60 nuclear weapons. There was some debate as to whether it was perhaps 30 actual weapons and fissile material for another 30, or somewhere in between. And that was higher than some outside non-government agency, non-government organization, or think tank estimates were. And also, those documents said that North Korea was likely able to produce another 7 to 12 weapons worth of fissile material every year. So, another tendency we've seen is over the years, people will tend to take one number and then just carry it forward until there's some new number. So, 10 years ago, some think tank might have said, well, they have 5 or 10. And then people will just quote that report for years without really updating it because there's no new information. So, at least according to the intel community, North Korea had perhaps 30 to 60 nuclear weapons back in 2017 with the ability to produce 7 to 12 weapons worth of material since then. Now, as for their missiles, with the ICBMs, as I said, in 2017, they demonstrated the ability to reach all of the continental US with an ICBM, which would be nuclear capable. So they can put a nuclear warhead anywhere in the continental US. Last year in October, they paraded an even larger ICBM. Now, since they can already reach all of the US with the existing ICBMs, the only reason to have a larger ICBM would be to carry multiple warheads. And Kim Jong un, a few months later, announced, yes, they are working towards a ICBM. So that is worrisome because the US only has 44 ground based interceptors in Alaska and California to intercept incoming North Korean ICBMs. And the US has said we would likely fire several, perhaps 4, at each incoming warhead or each incoming ICBM. So that limits the number of incoming North Korean warheads and missiles that we could target. So if they can put several warheads on a single missile, it could overwhelm our missile defenses. Another worrisome development in that October parade was that North Korea showed that they can indigenously produce these very large transporter erector launchers for the ICBMs, which are mobile. They go out on the roads and they can fire from any sort of firm road, not every little dirt road, but so they can go out into the field where it's harder for the US or South Korean intelligence sources to find them. So up until then, they had been limited in the number of mobile launchers by the number of very large Chinese logging trucks that they had purchased. I think it was 6. So the Chinese logging trucks are to carry very large logs or very large ICBMs. And North Korea kept sort of lengthening these launchers, adding axles until to accommodate the different ICBMs that they were developing. But it was the same limited number of launchers or transporter launchers. But so by showing that they had, in addition to those Chinese modified launchers, that they could produce their own, it also could risk overwhelming US missile defenses because more of them can go out into the field. So sort of think of it, if you had a lot of bullets, but you only had one 6-shooter and you could only carry one pistol out into the field against the enemy, you have to run back to headquarters to get more bullets. Well, if you can carry 2 or 3 or more pistols, then you can carry more bullets without having to run back and reload. So that was very worrisome. So they have not yet tested that very large ICBM, but that's something that we worry that they might, because North Korea traditionally has done something very highly provocative, such as a nuclear test or an ICBM test, the first year of a US and South Korean administration. So it would be expected they would do something to test the Biden administration as they tested the Trump and Bush and South Korean administrations. On other missiles shorter range than ICBM, they've demonstrated they have an intermediate range missile that can easily reach Guam, where we have critical US bases there, which would be in support of any kind of military operations in Northeast Asia, including on the Korean Peninsula. They also have a lot of different medium range and short range missiles that can threaten all of Japan and all of South Korea, including US forces and citizens stationed there or living there. And those are likely nuclear capable, or some of them are nuclear capable as well. In 2019, North Korea revealed 5 new short-range missile systems, each one an improvement over previous missiles. and they're all mobile. And one of them has a maneuverable trajectory, which might be able to evade missile defenses in South Korea. And then just a week or so ago, they demonstrated yet another new short range missile, which seems to be another one that could have a maneuverable trajectory. So, another worrisome development. So, they have a lot of missiles. They're increasingly more capable, and they increasingly can either evade or overwhelm missile defenses in South Korea and perhaps in the future, the continental US. So, all very worrisome developments. Another threat is cyber, and that is one that people often overlook or downplay for the reasons I said before. Um, and Kim Jong il, when he was the leader, he said, cyber attacks are like atomic bombs. War is won and lost by who has greater access to the adversary's military technical information in peacetime. So we know that North Korea sees military applications for cyber going against the US and South Korean, there's called infocentric kind of warfare, our reliance on GPS satellites for targeting, our precision guided munitions. So very heavily infocentric, electronic, all interconnected in networks. So if North Korea targets our ability to transfer or interconnect weapon systems and sensors through cyber, they see that as a very asymmetric ability to attack the US and South Korean ability to wage war against North Korea during a conflict. Kim Jong un, the current leader, declared that cyber warfare is a magic weapon and an all purpose sword that guarantees the North Korean People's Armed Forces ruthless striking capability along with nuclear weapons and missiles. So, North Korea has thousands of what they call cyber warriors. Perhaps 6,800 is one estimate from several years ago. And they have targeted a wide range of targets really throughout the world. And I'll get into some of the phases of those. And although, in a way, a lot of them are sort of you receive an email, please click on this malicious malware to upload systems that can undermine your computer system. They're much more sophisticated than that. So technically, they can get into computer systems, but also they have what are called social engineering programs, where they will convince people basically to click on a link, click on a document, and you would think people are too smart for that, but it's actually very effective because they go through a lot of different approaches. They'll approach, say, defense or military experts and say, "Hi, I'm from, say, Rand or some other defense contractor or defense firm, or we're from Boeing. We think you could, be a good addition to our company." And they would have created LinkedIn profiles and other sort of job searching or human resources profiles. So it really looks like it's coming from Boeing or some other defense contractor. They will even call prospective employees and speak in perfect English, and everything just seems fine. Or they will, gain access to someone's computer and then use that as a way of sort of winning the trust of someone else. And we've seen that even against experts on North Korea. They've targeted many of us, and they've been successful sometimes because they will look like they are coming from another expert that we all know, or even a college classmate, where they'll mimic the email address, they'll mimic the kind of messages that person sent, et cetera. So they are becoming very successful in the social engineering. So they've gained access to the governments, militaries, infrastructure networks, financial networks, banks, et cetera. So how good are they at this? The US and South Korea governments and intelligence agencies have said North Korea is in the top 3 or 4 countries in the world, along with China and Russia and perhaps Iran. So they are very good at this. The US government has warned that North Korea's illicit cyber activities threaten the United States and the broader international community, and in particular, pose a significant threat to the integrity and stability of the international financial system, and that Pyongyang has developed the capability to conduct disruptive or destructive cyber activities affecting US critical infrastructure. So North Korea has gone through sort of different phases in their cyber attacks. The beginning was sort of espionage. They were trying to get into governments and military websites to steal information, as well as a series of disruptive attacks through distributed denial of services, or DDoS attacks, where they would overwhelm a website by in getting malware onto thousands of computers that are then overwhelming the websites of their targets. So they, for example, got into highly restricted US military websites and got access to our war plan called Operations Plan 5015 for how we would respond to an all-out North Korean attack. They gained access to other contingency or war plans for other operations short of an all-out war. They've stolen technology from South Korean defense contractors. Sort of the list goes on and on. The next phase we saw was cyber terrorism. And I mentioned the Sony hack. And what that was is in response to a movie called The Interview with Seth Rogen and James Franco, which made fun of Kim Jong-un. Well, North Korea takes anything that they see as an insult, its leadership, very seriously. So they hacked into Sony Pictures. They got access to thousands of personal employee computers. They got access to, and they, even though the purpose was to try to prevent the release of that movie, and they had, they threatened not only to release the information of sort of embarrassing or proprietary information from these websites, or the computers and the websites. They went ahead and did it anyway, even though Sony said, we won't show the movie in theaters. Because along with the hack, North Korea also issued attacks to inflict 9/11 style attacks on any theater that showed that movie. And that fulfilled the legal definition for international terrorism. So that was one reason that North Korea eventually was put back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. So even though they didn't show the movie in the theaters, North Korea still went ahead and destroyed a lot of Sony computers. They released the information, proprietary, unreleased films, and contract and salary information. And when that information was made public, or that attack was made public, it led other organizations to cancel what would have been perceived as anti-Kim entertainment shows. So there was going to be a Steve Carell movie about North Korea. That was canceled because the other film producer was nervous about what North Korea might do. And also a British TV series that was going to be set in North Korea. That was also canceled because they were fearful of what North Korea might do. There was also, the next phase would be ransom, where they got in an operation called WannaCry, which was worldwide. They would inflict malware or ransomware on computers and said, okay, you can't get access to your computer anymore unless you pay us money. They actually didn't make a lot of money through some mistakes on their own, but they inflicted damage on the computers around the world. They really brought the United Kingdom's National Health Service to its knees. They were causing a lot of problem for hospitals, ambulance services, et cetera. They also had ransomware attacks on South Korean nuclear power plants, where they threatened to bring the nuclear power plants to a standstill, or do some damage to them if they didn't pay money. Then really the latest big shift is cybercrime. They've first gone after banks and traditional financial institutions, and then cyber exchanges, which with cyber currency, which are easier targets, softer. And then now they're going after decentralized finance platforms, or DeFis. So the UN panel of experts has estimated that they've acquired at least $2 billion from these cyber crimes. I think that's an underestimate. I've been doing research for a while on all these aspects of cyber. And even though I've been following North Korea for a long time, I was amazed at how much they've done until I really started digging into it. So one of the most famous early cases was with the Bank of Bangladesh, where they were able to do a cyber bank robbery, and they stole $81 million. They forced transfers through the Bangladesh bank's accounts in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they would have gotten away with another $851 million if a very alert bank employee hadn't noticed some typos. So they're going for about $1 billion in that cyber bank robbery, but they got away with 81 million. But since then, they've gone after countless banks and financial institutions. So they're able to transfer the money through international financial transfer networks, including what's called SWIFT. They've even worked in conjunction with local criminal groups in 30 different countries to get money from ATMs, where they've been able to get into the computer systems and create fake ATM cards, which then the bank will perceive as legitimate. And they were able to get millions of dollars as these criminals went to ATM machines in 30 different countries. They've also gone after cyber exchanges and cyber currency, Bitcoin and other alternative currencies. And then now these decentralized finance platforms, which are even more anonymous and more automatic in that you don't have to have humans even interacting on these transfers. So sort of think of it like if you're at an airport and you're transitioning money from dollars into a foreign currency, and it's all anonymous. It's just a machine. There's no keeping track of who you are. So it's a way of money laundering. And more recently, they've gone after pharmaceuticals. They've hacked into, we don't know if successfully or not, Pfizer and other pharmaceuticals that are working on COVID vaccines. And we don't know if that's to steal the information for the vaccines to make it themselves for their own citizens, or whether it's to steal the proprietary information to sell it perhaps to a Chinese pharmaceutical. But they have gone after pharmaceuticals. They've also gone after government ministries of health that are working on COVID. And also they see COVID relief as another way of making money. They'll mimic organizations that are legitimately in COVID relief, but they'll use it as a way of money from people saying, we're from the government, we're here to help you, just send money and we'll send you the vaccine. And they've also gone after even cyber security experts that have fallen prey to these kind of social engineering. Now, all of this is worrisome because they've stolen information, they've committed malware, they've committed cyber attacks, cyber terrorism, et cetera. But it's even more worrisome if you think of what they could do in a crisis. So either hostilities on the Korean Peninsula or the run up to a crisis, or just if they want to inflict a crisis on the world. They've shown that they can penetrate even highly secure, very deep computer networks of governments, militaries, pharmaceuticals, infrastructure sites, financial institutions, Federal Reserve banks, et cetera. So think of what they could do if they want to do more than just sort of testing or reconnaissance by fire, as they've done so far. So they could target the US and South Korean militaries, the infocentric way we would try to respond to any kind of North Korean attacks, either major attacks or tactical level attacks against the South. They could go after precision guided munitions, GPS, et cetera. We've seen over the years they've jammed GPS signals for hundreds of airplanes flying into airports in Seoul. They could do that against military planes and military munitions. They could do massive bank robberies or even target the integrity of international financial systems. If they did malware against cyber or against financial institutions, whether they ever wanted to get the money to release, control, or just prevent access to financial institutions, that could really have a major impact on the international financial system. Infrastructure, electrical grids, nuclear power plants, transportation, hospital facilities, air traffic control, supply chains. South Korea's intelligence service revealed that North Korea had developed a Trojan program, Trojan horse program, to take over computer networks and of power supply systems, including power stations, substations throughout South Korea. And in 2014, North Korean hackers started targeting railroad companies and airlines, and they specifically targeted an automated operating system that controls trains' speed. So there's a lot of things they could do uh, in addition to kinetic military threats. Now, let's turn to US policy. So, some general observations. So, not only is North Korea a very difficult intelligence problem, it's a very difficult foreign and national security problem or policy problem. So, a lot of very smart people have been trying to solve the various North Korean problems for decades. So it's not there's not a simple solution out there. Um, it could be one of those unsolvable problems for foreign policy and security policy. And another thing is, as we look at individual administrations' policies and either praise or critique them, no U.S. political party or U.S. administration has a monopoly on good or bad ideas when it comes to North Korea. So there are things we can fault. They were too hard, they were too soft, or they were both at different times. But it's extremely difficult problem. So one thing that long-term Korea watchers tend to be is both pessimistic and cynical. We've seen it all before. So when someone will say these old ideas haven't worked, we need bold new thinking, chances are we've already tried that. So when someone will say, whether it's an outside expert or in the government, would say the Biden administration saying they're going to have a policy that's different from every previous policy, well, we'll wait and see what it is, but it's likely going to be using the same tools and the same instruments and national power that other administrations did, perhaps in a different combination or different prioritization to the tools. But it's pretty unlikely it's going to be something that no one has previously thought of. So again, sometimes when you see someone say, "Well, we have a bold new idea. This will solve things," no, it hasn't been tried before, and us old timers will tend to look at each other and say, "Yeah, remember when we did that in 2009? Oh yeah, 2001, 1997, 1994." So um, we've been around the block a few times with North Korea. Now, a common debate we have on policy, which is really a false paradigm of should we do diplomacy or sanctions, or engagement or pressure. And that's like saying, which tool should you use to build a house? Do you use a hammer or a screwdriver? Well, you use both, along with a whole bunch of other tools. Sometimes one's more appropriate, sometimes another is appropriate, but you need them all. So there's this false debate, and even if in a panel conference or other event, if we sort of put it in a context of, okay, so today's event is on sanctions, but of course we need to have a comprehensive integrated strategy using all the instruments of national power, dime, diplomatic, information, military, economic. Uh, we use all of them together. So now let's talk about sanctions. And then usually the first answer is, oh, so you want to do sanctions? That means you don't believe in diplomacy. Well, that's not the case. So another sort of false statement we have is, or a false characterization is, well, sanctions by themselves haven't worked. Well, no one said they should be done by themselves, just as we're not saying we should only do diplomacy or we should only do military deterrence. You use all the tools, but you often see sanctions by themselves haven't worked, so we should abandon and try something which has never been tried before, which is diplomacy, like the 8 failed agreements we've had, the international community has had with North Korea, all of which failed. And also there's that standard that's applied to sanctions that isn't applied to diplomacy. So, well, sanctions haven't gotten North Korea to abandon every one of its nuclear weapons, so let's eliminate all sanctions. Well, again, diplomacy hasn't worked either. That's not to say we don't keep trying for a 9th agreement or a 10th or whatever, but hopefully learn from some of the mistakes of the past. Also, sanctions are often depicted as only having one purpose, which is to alter North Korean behavior to get them to abandon their nuclear program. Well, sanctions and targeted financial measures and law enforcement measures, which all kind of come under this rubric of sanctions, have a number of objectives. And I would say there are 5 main objectives. The first two is to enforce UN resolutions and US laws. If they mean anything, you have to enforce them. The second is to impose a penalty or a pain on those that violate laws or resolutions. You rob a bank, you go to jail. There's a penalty for that. Just because there's still some people who rob banks doesn't mean you rip up the laws against bank robberies. The third objective is that it, if not eliminates, it constrains or makes more difficult or raises the cost of North Korea importing items they need for their nuclear and missile programs, which are prohibited by the UN resolutions, uh, including money from illicit activities. You're trying to curtail the items they need from the outside world, technical or money from money laundering or illicit activities that they use for the nuclear and missile programs. The fourth objective would be to try to prevent or at least constrain proliferation of nuclear and missile items or components or technology. And then the fifth, in conjunction with diplomacy and everything else, is you're trying to get them to moderate behavior, to obey US laws, to obey UN resolutions. Another aspect against sanctions or targeted financial measures is that not all sanctions are the same. And I would make a big distinction between UN sanctions and US sanctions. UN sanctions are more easily undone. You can get the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to change their mind tomorrow. And if everyone agreed, you can alter, remove, modify the sanctions. US sanctions are mostly US law. Some are executive orders, but some are US law. So it would require the US Congress to change US law to alter the US sanctions. And really, on a very strongly bipartisan basis, there's not a mood in Congress to relax the pressure on North Korea. In 2016, when the US Congress passed the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, the vote was 96 to 2 in the Senate, and I believe 408 to 2 or, in the House of Representatives. I may be a little bit off there. A year later, when they passed another bill, it was 98 to 0 and 409 to 1, I think, in the Senate and the House. So, and since then, with North Korea doing a number of nuclear and missile tests, there's not really a mood in either political party to relax pressure on North Korea. Another difference between the UN and US sanctions is UN sanctions are predominantly on their nuclear and missile programs. So we keep adding resolutions whenever North Korea violates the previous resolution. So we're up to 11 UN resolutions now against the nuclear and missile programs. And so that, according to those resolutions, North Korea is not only precluded from doing a nuclear test or an ICBM test, but precluded from doing any missile test of any range if it uses ballistic missile technology, even if it's a short range. Also, the continued existence of the WMD, not only nuclear, but also biological, chemical warfare programs and the missile programs, the continued existence are themselves violations because the UN has called on them to abandon those programs in a comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible manner. So when you hear of CVID or that dismantlement, it's not just a US negotiating position, it's a requirement under the 11 UN resolutions. The US sanctions are not only about nuclear and missile, but also about a range of other issues, human rights, as well as criminal activities such as counterfeiting of our currency or money laundering or other crimes. Now, one thing about, say, money laundering, when people will think, well, how can we sanction a North Korean entity? We don't do any trade with North Korea, so sanctioning a company or an entity can't have any possible effect. Well, it can. And what that is based on a couple of things. The vast majority of all international financial transactions in the world are denominated in dollars. And because of that, they have to go by law through a US Treasury Department regulated bank in the United States. So if you send money, if you wire or transfer money from Paris to London, it actually goes through New York. It doesn't seem like it, but it does because it's not going to be denominated in euros. It's likely going to be denominated in dollars. So we know from the UN panel of experts that the majority of Chinese and North Korean and other financial transactions are still denominated in dollars. So they're coming through US banks. So therefore, if they are doing money laundering or other crimes, it's a US crime in the US financial system on US soil. So what happens is people will have correspondent accounts. So again, with the Paris to London, it would be if you were in Paris, your French bank has an account or a correspondent account or a branch in New York. The British bank has a correspondent account or a branch in New York, and it sort of goes through that way. It's all very transparent to you. You don't realize it's going through New York. Anyway, that gives us the authority to uh, broker or monitor or impose sanctions on North Korean and other entities that are violating U.S. law. So those who are breaking the law and money laundering and other crimes, we can impose fines. The Obama administration imposed $8 billion in fines on British and French banks for money laundering for Iran. So far, we've imposed $0 on Chinese banks in fines for money laundering for North Korea. We can also identify an entity as a primary money laundering concern, which means they can't access the US financial system. And for a financial institution, that's the kiss of death because no one will want to interact with you because they are fearful of also being sanctioned if they engage with you in, unbeknownst to them, illicit activity. So when people say we ought to reduce US sanctions, so, well, which ones? Those against human rights violations, those against criminal activity. And if you say, well, eliminate all US sanctions, it would be, okay, so money laundering will remain a crime except if you're North Korean. Or committing crimes against humanity, as the UN says North Korea is a human rights violation or crime, except if you're North Korean. Well, that doesn't work. The thing about UN sanctions is not only are they more easily undone, because a lot of them in recent years have imposed constraints on North Korean economic activity, they're more negotiable. They're more able to be sliced and diced. So, for example, in negotiations, if North Korea were to abandon 5 nuclear weapons or to demobilize or deactivate a certain number of production facilities, then they could be allowed to export X 100,000 tons more of oil or import oil or export coal. So I think the UN sanctions are more fungible, they're more negotiable, and those are the ones that could be included in denuclearization negotiations or arms control negotiations with North Korea, as opposed to the US sanctions, which are harder to undo and deal with a lot more issues than just nuclear and missile. So turning to the Biden policy, there's known and unknowns. What we've seen from statements by Biden before he was elected and after he was elected, as well as some other officials, I think probably the biggest change we'll see, at least in the near term, is U.S. policy toward South Korea and other allies. So Biden and others have said they will return to what has been a long-standing, traditional, bipartisan U.S. view of alliances as based on common principles, common values, common objectives, rather than the Trump administration's view, which is seeing them as transactional relationships. So what we saw in what are called special measures agreement negotiations, where it determines the level of host nation support or the amount of money that allies reimburse a percentage of the cost of stationing U.S. forces overseas. What we've done is in previous negotiations, the allies would, every usually 5 years, add an incremental increase. Under the Trump administration, we were seeking a 400% or a 500% increase from South Korea and Japan, which was which would have covered more than the cost of stationing our forces overseas. Having our forces overseas is in U.S. national strategic interest. During isolationism in the 1930s, going back into the castle, raising the drawbridge didn't work very well. Isolationism doesn't work. And it's like having policemen walking the beat in a bad neighborhood rather than sitting back at headquarters. It's better to have the policemen or U.S. forces out in potentially bad areas because it deters either criminals or bad actors from doing things. So it's cheaper to prevent a war than it is to fight a war. So under the previous administration, we were seeking to make a profit off of our sons and daughters stationed overseas. So the Biden administration has said they're not going to do that. They're going to go back to a traditional view. And we've seen at least preliminary completion of SMA negotiations with South Korea and Japan. There's hasn't been an official release of what the number is, but it's likely a 13% increase in South Korea's contribution rather than 400 or 500%. And that's what South Korea was offering 2 years ago. I think we'll also see the Biden administration try to become more involved in improving relations between our critically important allies, South Korea and Japan. During the Obama administration, when there was a previous flare-up of tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, U.S. officials got pretty involved in behind-the-scenes activity with both capitals, sending pretty stern private messages to both Tokyo and Seoul on history issues, trying to, if not solve, at least bring some resolution of the history issues, which was impeding on not only the bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo, but the ability to have trilateral coordination with the United States addressing the common threats of North Korea and China. So Tony Blinken, Kurt Campbell, and others, and even then Vice President Biden, got personally involved. And that in part led to the Comfort Women Agreement of December 2015. So during the more recent flare-up, the Trump administration was largely hands-off in trying to ameliorate the tensions between our two allies. And I think the Biden administration is going to try to get involved, not as a public arbiter or judge on which country is correct on history or which country has done the correct or incorrect response to another action, but behind the scenes trying to reduce tension, at least reach some kind of resolution to push the history issue to the back burner so we can address the growing and very dangerous threats that we all face. Biden and others have also said there's going to be a return to the traditional bottom-up approach of policymaking and reaching out to North Korea. So the bottom-up meaning you have diplomats try to engage with North Korea, try to make progress on detailed arms control or denuclearization agreements. And then if you have progress or you've made enough progress that you need very senior intervention, then you would have a summit, as opposed to having the top-down approach under the Trump administration. So I was against that approach, but at least it did put to the test the idea that some had was, since the North Korean leader is the only one who can make decisions in North Korea, you have to have the two leaders get together, and that's the only way to solve the problem. Well, we got the leaders together, and it didn't lead to solving the nuclear and other issues. So I'm in favor of a bottom-up approach where you have very detailed, comprehensive agreements, as we did arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, rather than very vague, short agreements as we've had in the past with North Korea. But two large unknowns, and I'll bring this to an end, and I look forward to your questions. I think two big unknowns of what the Biden administration policy on North Korea will be are what would be the parameters of an acceptable agreement and how firmly or fully will they enforce UN resolutions and US law. So right now there's a debate amongst Korea watchers as to either maintaining the denuclearization objective that's required under the UN resolutions, or saying North Korea will never abandon their nuclear weapons, so give up on that and instead go for a partial or incomplete agreement that's arms control, that's capping the problem, limiting the problem. We can get into that debate and questions and answers if you want. But so far, the Trump administration, including Secretary Blinken during this recent trip to Asia, had said that the objective will continue to be denuclearization. Now, that doesn't mean, as some have depicted, denuclearization as we don't give any benefits whatsoever until North Korea has cut up the last nuclear weapon and last missile and all of and destroyed all the production facilities. Any agreement, whether it's arms control or a larger denuclearization, would have to be implemented incrementally. So the difference is, the way I see it is, it's like if you think of American football, it's like a 100-yard agreement where, because we've had a lot of failed agreements and or all sides think the other cheated, like with the arms control treaties, and I was a member of the arms control delegation in Europe and head of the arms control staff at the CIA. You define the parameters of the field, you define what a football is, you define what the referee's responsibilities are, you define everything so you can't be accused of cheating. Now, you define the end goal of that's the end zone, or that's denuclearization, and that's all the benefits that the U.S. will provide. But even though it's a 100-yard agreement, you implement it in 5-yard increments. Others would say that's never going to happen. So instead, just negotiate a 5-yard agreement. And if everyone's happy with that, then you negotiated a second 5-yard, another, and another. It's a good debate we can have. So far, the administration has said that they are maintaining denuclearization as the end goal, but we don't know what benefits they would give to North Korea, in which order, what the linkages would be. Would they accept incremental agreements? So we don't know yet. And even when they release the North Korea policy, I think they'll keep a lot of cards close to the chest because they don't want to negotiate in public. They want to get to the table with North Korea. Unfortunately, North Korea has continued to reject repeated requests from the Biden administration as well as Trump and previous administrations for dialogue. The other thing we don't know is how firmly will they enforce sanctions. So each administration in the U.S. has underachieved in fulfilling, even fully enforcing U.S. laws. So the Trump administration said they had maximum pressure. It was never maximum. President Trump in 2018 said there are 300 North Korean entities he's not sanctioning because we're talking so nicely to North Korea. That would be 300 entities violating U.S. law in the U.S. financial system on U.S. soil, for which we have evidence, and we're not sanctioning them because we're talking. And there's a long list of other things we didn't do. The Biden administration didn't fully enforce laws. Bush did things. We can go into that in Q&A. So we don't know how they will apply sanctions, whether they'll see it as a diplomatic tool or a law enforcement tool. So anyway, I've gone on for a very long time, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Klingner, for such an insightful lecture, and we'll take questions now. So if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box. The first question is, as a world policy expert, do you think the loose behavior of Trump in handling North Korea has contributed to the current agony?
I'm sorry, the what behavior of Trump?
Loose behavior?
Well, I think it was counterproductive, both the very threatening language in 2017, the sort of the verbal threats and or verbal attacks. I don't think that's useful. North Korea always does it, but I don't think we need to kind of go down the path of name calling. Also, with the threats of a preventive attack, which is different from normal U.S. strategy, which is either retaliatory attacks or a preemptive attack. If we have very good intelligence that someone is about to attack us, we may go first. Preventive attack was threatening to attack North Korea to prevent them from completing an ICBM program, which they likely had already completed. It brought us very close to war, as the president said and other senior officials said. Closer to war, perhaps, than 1994 or the 1976 axe murders, whatever. That was not productive. The other, I feel it was also unproductive to go to the other extreme of not enforcing our laws, of having summits without conditions, of canceling our military exercises and getting nothing in return from North Korea, either diplomatic concessions or constraints on their own large-scale military exercises. So Like I said, I didn't agree with the summit strategy, but it did test that hypothesis. So we were no more successful with that strategy than with previous strategies.
Thank you. And the next question is, in 2017, North Korean representatives tried to sound you out, along with other experts in DC, for insights into the incoming Trump administration's approach to the Korean Peninsula. Are you aware of any recent similar attempts to contact your colleagues who are perceived to be close to the Biden administration?
Um, the Biden administration has said they tried to reach out a number of times to North Korean counterparts, including through the New York Channel, and North Korea was not interested in dialogue. And that's consistent with Steve Biegun, the previous North Korea negotiator with North Korea. He had trouble getting meetings after the October 2019 meeting in Stockholm. North Korea said they were not interested in any more of these disgusting working level meetings, and they didn't want to have a summit, et cetera. And Biegun's predecessors, Danny Russell, Joe Yun, Song Kim, all complained that they couldn't get meetings. The last couple of years, North Korea hasn't engaged in what's called track 1.5 meetings like they used to. And even when there were meetings where they were supposed to show up, they canceled at the last minute. So there may be some meetings that people have had that I'm not aware of, but as we exchanged information amongst experts, in the last couple of years there have been a lot fewer of these meetings, and then I think COVID really also put a damper on it because they've been very strict on imposing on themselves restrictions on travel in and out of North Korea. So I'm not aware of track 1.5 meetings.
Thank you. And the next question is, the concern for U.S. foreign policy has been focused on the nuclear issue. The cyber element has given the North Koreans another type of weapon to use against the U.S. How should or can the U.S. respond to this double-headed threat?
Well, I'm actually struggling with the recommendations section of this paper on cyber right now. So with cyber, it's a number of things. It's because it's more deniable, more anonymous, it's sort of harder to react. Whereas North Korean nuclear and missiles, they'll do things, but they're not attacking us generally. And when they do a launch, then we do a certain number of sanctions or diplomatic demarches, et cetera. But with cyber, it's more what's known as gray zone. It's like, well, we think it's North Korea, or the cyber experts are really sure it's North Korea. But how do you respond? They are much less connected to the internet and things. They have far fewer infocentric systems in their country than others do. So it's really a question of how do you respond? Do you do cyber attacks on them? Their banks aren't doing a lot of international transactions, so you can't go after their bank accounts like they can go after ours. So I think it's going to have to be multifaceted. It's the incoming administration is going to have sort of a whole of government approach where we look at it not just as a Department of Justice or Department of Treasury problem, but because it could have impact on military, we also need DOD, Department of Homeland Security, because they could come after infrastructures, a whole of government approach. You also need, let's say, a whole of country approach where we interact with the private sector, because you got a lot of cyber experts outside of government who can identify the attacks that North Korea has done, both through its government agencies and lots of outside group or North Korea affiliated groups, Kim Suki and Raptor and all these others, that we need interaction between industry and cyber experts, financial institutions, and then a whole of world approach where the defenses are only as strong as the weakest link. So if they can get into a bank in some country overseas, well, then they may be able to use that bank as a way of getting into the international financial transfer system, et cetera, and get into U.S. banks. So it's going to have to be improving cyber defenses. It's going to be thinking of how to retaliate. It's going to have to look at existing legislation. Is it able to address cybercrime as well as against other actions. A problem though with cyber is, you know, you can have a really strong castle defense, but if you've got one guy who's tricked into lowering the drawbridge, they get into the castle. So if you get one guy who feels he's clicking on what's a job offer link, well, now his computer and then his bank's computer and then other banks' computers are all now infected, no matter how good a cyber defense you have.
Thank you. And the next question is, how effective would a bottom-up approach be considering the recent top-down diplomacy that Kim likes better?
Well, I mean, some could legitimately say, well, the top down didn't work and the bottom up didn't work. So what do we do? Medium? Um, it's Kim, I think, would like a top down uh, because he feels he may get more concessions that way. But, there was a difference between the Singapore and the Hanoi summits, one where we agreed to a very weak summit statement, and then the next where we walked away from what would have been a bad deal. So it may not be so much whether it's top down or bottom up, but whether North Korea is willing to reach a comprehensive or real agreement. So we can argue amongst ourselves as to whether we go for, a Hail Mary pass of denuclearization or something short of that, or what benefits do we link to what steps forward. But the problem now is North Korea won't talk at both a summit level and a working level. So what it leaves us with often is negotiating amongst ourselves. So what we often tend to do is we'll offer something either diplomatic meeting or publicly, and then North Korea will say no, that's not good enough, and we'll say, oh, okay, well they haven't said what they want. Maybe we should offer this too. And then we offer something else and they'll say that's not good enough. So we often keep throwing more and more onto the table. The other problem is North Korea won't really define what it wants. So during the Stockholm meetings, the US was even just trying to say, okay, when you say a security guarantee, what do you mean? Is it a statement? Is it a piece of paper? How is that different from the 20 some security guarantees we've already given you that were in the agreed framework and the six-party talk statements? And North Korea refused to define what they meant by security guarantee. Similarly, peace statement. What do you mean? They refused. You say, sanctions are a problem. Which ones? Well, they tend to say all of them. You say it's the U.S. hostile policy. What do you mean by that? And they refuse to define it. So, over the years, they've defined U.S. hostile policy as everything from military exercises, the presence of U.S. forces in Korea, the alliance with Korea, the nuclear umbrella or extended deterrence guarantee, any and all U.S. and UN sanctions, any criticism of North Korea, including on human rights, even the constitutionally protected freedoms of speech and media in South Korea. So all of those have been defined as hostile policy. So the first step is really just to get North Korea into a negotiating room at whatever level, but right now it's at a working level.
Thank you. And if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box. So the next question is, given Kamala Harris' lack of experience, how would you anticipate their judging her and what they might sneak in? And that's new?
I guess I'm not sure. So the vice president doesn't have a lot of Korea experience, but I don't think she would be the one doing the negotiations. So I'm unclear of the question. So was it Kamala Harris would be? I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Given Kamala Harris's lack of experience, how would you anticipate their judging her and what they might sneak in?
Well, I don't think she would be involved in the negotiation. So either it would be Biden if it's a summit level negotiation or meeting, and he's got a lot of foreign policy experience, including chair of the Foreign Relations Committee for I think 10 years. or it would be at the working level, whether it's Song Kim or Mr. Krittenbeck or other State Department and NSC officials. So it'd be one way or the other, but the vice president, I don't think, would be involved.
Thank you. And the next question is related to IT. North Korea has high-level IT technology, though. Can international society send outside information into the online network of North Korean elite group?
I think it's very difficult. There have been some reporting that uh, after some North Korean action that their internet, such as it is, went down for a few days, and people interpreted that as a sort of a U.S. attack, like we did Stuxnet against the Iranian nuclear program. I think the jury's out as to whether that was something the U.S. actually did. But certainly, the country and the citizens have a lot less access to the outside world than in other countries. My understanding is there's sort of four levels of access to internet or intranet, and only sort of senior officials can have access to the outside world. And also, North Korea has imposed a lot of very sophisticated monitoring of IT programs and systems within North Korea. So some had thought, well, once there's sort of computer programs or computers in North Korea, well, people might be able to use that to organize demonstrations, et cetera. Well, actually, North Korea has been able to use it to impose even stricter control over people. So some examples are you're not allowed to upload any software that's not permitted by the regime. The system, the operating system, will periodically randomly take a screenshot of your computer. So if you have something that's forbidden, you could get a visit by the security service. And they have a way of tracking even any kind of thumb drive you put into the computer is detected, and the operating system will put tags on it so it can keep track of who saw what. So it's harder to go after them via cyber because it's much less access to the outside world, and also they're much less reliant on it for banks and infrastructure and things like that.
Thank you. We have a couple of more interesting questions keep coming up. So the next question is North Korea just a puppet of China? How much influence does China have on North Korea? Can we cooperate with China to ask them to do more about North Korea?
I'd say two aspects to that is we've tried to get China to help us with North Korea, and they've repeatedly shown themselves to be more part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I don't think North Korea likes what North Korea is doing, particularly with the nuclear program, but they've been unwilling to impose the kind of pressure we would like them to, or to fully enforce resolutions and sanctions as we would like them to do. What we've seen Beijing do, usually for a few months, well, if North Korea does something very provocative, a nuclear test or an ICBM or long range test, China will agree to a incrementally stronger resolution. It took us 11 resolutions to get to where we are, as opposed to a fewer number, because China would drag its feet. And then China will enforce the resolutions for a few months, and then they will turn a blind eye, and we've seen ship-to-ship transfers of oil, and et cetera. And we've also been unwilling to go after their banks that are committing money laundering crimes. So, for example, in 2017, the US Congress sent a list of 12 Chinese banks, including the four largest in the world, that they felt were committing money laundering crimes in the US financial system. They sent the list to the White House in 2017. They've taken action against none of them. So there are things we could do to influence Chinese behavior. And what we saw we can influence Chinese banks even to go against what the Chinese government has directed them to do. Now, the relationship between North Korea and China, I think a common thought is that because China is so huge, North Korea is so small, and that China is responsible for 90% of North Korean foreign trade, that China must control little North Korea. It's actually not the case. So Korea has 5,000 years of history, including 1,000 or so invasions by its neighbors. Korea, I think both North and South, are very suspicious of its neighbors. A very common Korean saying is they feel that they are a shrimp amongst whales, and when the whales fight, it's the shrimp's back that is broken. So what we've seen with all three generations of North Korean leaders is very critical, very suspicious comments about China. I think Kim Il-sung even said, we need to be more concerned about China than the United States. So even during the heyday of the relationship between North Korea and China during the Cold War under Kim Il-sung, he was able to play off the two communist superpowers of the Soviet Union and China against each other, as each of those two countries was competing to be the leader of the communist world and trying to get as many communist countries in their camp against the other. And North Korea was able to play off both of them against each other to get benefits from both and really be beholden to both, to neither. So although it just really seems counterintuitive, little North Korea is able to push back against Chinese influence, and really they are their own masters, as it were. And that even comes up in questions about, how could North Korea come up with these nuclear weapons and ICBMs? They must have gotten it from Moscow or Beijing. No, they are indigenous programs, though they may have gotten technology or expertise from others, including China and Russia, but they are indigenous programs, and they were driven by North Korean suspicion of its communist allies or friends. In 1962, North Korea saw that the Soviet Union sold out Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, abandoned Cuba in their view. So they must have a nuclear weapons program of their own. And in 1964, when China didn't share the results from its nuclear tests with North Korea, again, Pyongyang said, well, we can't trust China either. So again, we need our own nuclear weapons program.
Thank you. And the next question is, Chinese-Russian rapprochement militarily and diplomatically would seem to benefit North Korea. How should the U.S. respond?
Well, that's far outside of my little lane in the road. I usually stop working at the north end of the Yalu River. So not only China and Russia rapprochement, but also the strains in the U.S.-China relationship, make things difficult for resolving the North Korean problem. That said, even if we had great relations between the U.S. and China and bad relations between China and Russia, it would still be difficult solving North Korea. A few years back when the U.S. and the international community was imposing sanctions on Russia for its incursion into Ukraine, Russia turned to China thinking, well, I can get, offset these sanctions or offset business dealings with the Western world with China. We're both outcasts, we're both communists, etc. And yet what Russia found was that China just saw it as an opportunity to strike really tough business deals. So, we'll have to see what level of rapprochement it is, but even in recent years, it wasn't such that they had total alignment on policy. But North Korea is not necessarily something that, even if those two countries were at odds with each other, that they would then help us out on.
Thank you. And the next question is pretty long.
Okay.
So one of our attendees saying thank you for an illuminating presentation. Given that North Korea will likely never give up their nuclear weapons, might it be feasible for us to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state in return for their agreement to halt further developing or even reduce their existing arsenal? And how would you evaluate the rising presence of Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister? Is it relevant enough? If feasible, would establishing a physical diplomatic outpost or even an embassy in North Korea improve relations, notwithstanding all the logistic and security issues that would be involved?
There are a lot of good questions in there. On the accepting North Korea, sometimes we trip over semantics on that. So um, if we there's sort of accepting, acknowledging, sort of two different words. If we were to say we formally accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, that is seen as very detrimental to the Nonproliferation Treaty, as well as decades of U.S. nonproliferation strategy, where we try to limit the number of countries that are nuclear powers. The concern would be that if you just basically rip up the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's a green light for Iran and a lot of other countries to say, oh, okay, fine, there's no penalties to going nuclear, so why don't we do it too? So there's that concern. Also, I think our allies, South Korea and Japan, would be very concerned because they would see it as, well, it plays into the fear of decoupling, where it's, oh, all right, well, you're going to accept nuclear weapon state, or so you're going to accept the nuclear weapons that can attack our allies, or fearful that we'll accept a deal that perhaps limits or caps or removes the ICBM threat to the United States, but keeps in place the shorter or medium range or intermediate range threats to our allies. So it's sort of a series of dominoes. Now, people will say, well, haven't we accepted them as a nuclear state for years? And it's clear they have nuclear weapons. I guess I would see it as a difference between accepting and acknowledging or even assessing. So an analogy would be if someone is holding hostages inside a house with the pistol, a policeman can look through the window and say, yeah, he's got a gun. I don't accept that behavior. I don't accept that illegal use of weapons, but I have to assess that he has a pistol. Yes, they have nuclear weapons. Yes, he has a pistol in that house. I'm not accepting it. I'm not acknowledging it in the sense of accepting it, but I assess it, and I will take actions to try to remove that pistol or remove the nuclear weapon. So some of it's semantics, but I don't think we want to start the dominoes of accepting them because it could have a series of negative repercussions. On the kind of capping the problem, it depends on what you do or what aspects of it, as well as verification. So we have a really good capability of remotely detecting any kind of nuclear test underground. There are seismic sensors all around the world, and we can pretty clearly detect very quickly, instantly, when there has been a seismic event. And then because of the characteristics of it, you can quickly determine whether it's natural or man-made, and then you assess whether it's conventional explosives like in a mining accident or mining event, or nuclear. That's harder to detect. And you can detect missile launches, pretty well. But things like production of plutonium, that requires a large, pretty easy to find reactor. Highly enriched uranium is a lot harder to find because it's small centrifuges, and you can put a bunch in a lot of basements or around the country. And unless you have on-site inspection, it's really hard to determine if they have stopped production of uranium. Some would say, well, prevent further development or refinement of weapons. Well, okay, if it's testing of missiles, you got that. Nuclear tests, you'll detect that. But how do you detect whether they've done, multiple reentry vehicle testing or creation, et cetera? So a lot of even the capping the problem is you need on-site verification. You can't freeze what you can't see, or you can't be sure that they aren't cheating. So again, with the Soviet Union and the arms control treaties, we had very clear statements and requirements for verification, including on-site inspection, in those arms control treaties. They're very detailed verification protocols. And in conjunction with national technical means, we couldn't say there's 100% certainty they're not cheating, but it was able to reduce it to what was not militarily significant. So yes, they might have a nuclear weapon. Well, but they likely don't have enough that it would have an impact in a war. So Um, we still need verification even for an incremental or a small scale or a cap and freeze issue. With Kim Yo Jong, her fortunes seem to ebb and flow. When she issues a statement in her name, when she's, her statement is on the front page of Nodong Shinmun and others, it's like, oh my God, this shows she's second in command. Because Kim's children, Kim Jong Un's children, are too young to be successors, so she must be the second most powerful person in North Korea. Then, she seemed to sort of suffer, a demotion after the Hanoi summit. She seemed to be contradicted by her brother after her very strong statements against South Korea with the liaison office that was blown up in middle of last year, et cetera. And in North Korea, being the second most powerful person is often a very dangerous position to be in. It didn't work out for Jong Song Taek and others. So I think it's Kim is very firmly in control. He's much more trusting of a sibling. Whether if he were to die suddenly, we don't know who the next leader would be. There's nothing in the Constitution. So would it be a family member like her? Would it be the uncle who was in exile for decades, who's now back in North Korea? I don't think he has much of a power base. Or would it be some government functionary? We don't know. Then there's a whole debate about whether in a very strictly traditional Confucian society would they accept a woman, et cetera. The answer is we don't know. So she does seem to have a lot of clout, but I think even if Kim Jong-un has delegated some authority or responsibilities, he's delegated responsibilities to her and others, but I don't think he's delegated his authorities. And then on the embassy, we tried before. It was North Korea. The embassies and a liaison office were going to be part of the agreed framework in the 1990s, but it was North Korea that prevented a U.S. facility in Pyongyang, as well as they pulled the plug on a North Korean facility in Washington. So it's something that has often been offered up. But I don't think in and of itself it's going to lead to improved relations.
Thank you. And the next question is, do you think North Korea will continue to ignore and refuse contact with the US until after the next South Korean election this time next year?
I think eventually they'll come back to allowing contact with the US. We don't know when. So just as with the next provocation, it's a question of when rather than if. We know they're going to do a provocation. And provocation is this unsatisfactory term we use to encompass a lot of things. Acts of war, acts of terror, violations, and even things that might be standard military exercises or developmental testing. So we kind of lump them all together. So, they're going to do something, whether it's a short range, medium range, or ICBM or nuke test. It would be expected they do something major this year because they feel that it gives them leverage. It forces the U.S. back to the table. It forces the U.S. to offer concessions. And as a North Korean defector once told me, they do it to train us like a dog, to train them like a dog. It's often counterproductive. It leads to stronger policies by the U.S. or South Korea than otherwise might have been the case. But sometimes they will combine a highly provocative act with if you want to reduce tensions, you can come back to the table giving us what we want. So sort of we'll raise tensions and we'll offer you the opportunity to buy us back to a lower level of tensions. So I think, before Moon has an election, I think they'll reach out to the U.S. and South Korea. It's just a matter of when and under what conditions. So far, what they've said, including at Kim Yo Jong and Kim Jong Un's level, is we're not interested in engagement unless you basically capitulate to their positions. And if we're not going to do that, but we're willing to have meetings, maybe eventually they'd be willing to have some kind of meeting as well.
Thank you. And due to the limit of time, we'll just take one more question. What are China's goals in North Korea besides stability? It seems that they help it evade some sanctions while at the same time enforcing them?
I think stability is a good one. They say they want no war, they want no nuclear weapons, and I think it's basically just to keep things stable. So they don't want uh, a resolution in the sense of unification of the Korean Peninsula under a free and democratic system, because they don't want that on their borders. They also don't want to have North Korea collapse because they're afraid of what would happen during a crisis. Who's got control of the nukes? Could it lead to a war? Could it lead to explosion or implosion? Um, what would happen if they lost to their closest ally, North Korea? Then would others say, well, if you can't keep North Korea, then maybe the rest of us will get frisky and push back against Beijing. But so they don't want a crisis. They don't want a real resolution. In some ways, they're sort of like the circus performer, spinning the plates on a stick. You have to just keep spinning the plate to keep it stable enough that it doesn't crash. You're not making any progress, but at least the crockery isn't breaking. And it seems like that's what China's policy has been. They keep urging the U.S. and others to offer concessions to North Korea. So if North Korea acts up, they'll usually say, well, why can't you two Koreas get along? And why can't we let's all go back to the table? Well, it's only your Korea that's acting up. So I think the stability and just preventing a major problem while hoping to resolve it through some kind of negotiations with the U.S. giving more concessions while keeping North Korea there on their border is probably what they're looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Klingner, for such a very insightful lecture and taking so many interesting questions. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'd like to share the AILS upcoming event with Dr. Patrick Cronin at the Hudson Institute. He will be presenting a lecture on fear and insecurity addressing North Korean threat perceptions on his report on April 14th at 4 o'clock. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today, and this concludes our presentation today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.